Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Happy to be joined by Kate Eberle-Walker, CEO of Presence Learning, and someone with an interesting background in education, educational technology, and most recently telehealth and teletherapy. And I think that's really what we wanted to focus on with Kate today. So, Kate, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
And can you talk a little bit about, your background in education and in business, and what led you to Presence Learning?
Sure, absolutely. I started my career in finance, working on Wall Street and investment banking. And one of my favorite clients was Washington Post Company, which owned Kaplan.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to know Kaplan and got into education through that path.
Mm-hmm.
And I joined Kaplan after business school and spent 9 years doing acquisitions, investments,
Mm-hmm.
business development partnerships, really getting to know everything about every aspect of the education business all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I joined IAC, which had bought tutor.com and was looking to expand on a platform for online consumer education.
Mm-hmm.
We combined that with Princeton Review, and I became the CEO of that entity and led it for a few years until we sold that business. And when I was looking at other companies and looking for what I was going to do next, I got to know Presence Learning and got really excited about the idea of using teletherapy in schools to deliver services to students. It was very similar to a lot of what I had done over the years at Kaplan and Princeton Review in terms of using technology to better connect students with experts. And it was a way of doing that and using technology to connect therapists with the students in schools who need them.
Very cool. And very similar to the live online programs we've been running at Kaplan for over 10 years here at Test Prep, which is very close to my heart. So can you talk a little bit about what telehealth is? And, there's, I guess more broadly, there's telehealth, telemedicine is another way in which, I've heard that as historically where a lot of this began. And then teletherapy. You guys at Presence Learning are focused, I guess, on the telehealth, special education, and teletherapy. But I'd love to hear you give us a little more context around that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, telehealth or teletherapy in its simplest form is a patient connecting with a clinician through a screen instead of physically in a room. And that does take all forms. I mean, there are really interesting things happening in broader medicine where MDs are connecting with patients through a screen instead of in person. In our case at Presence Learning, we're connecting speech therapists, occupational therapists, school psychologists, and social workers with students through a screen. And so, for us, as in these other areas of telehealth, it's really all about expanding access to experts. There's often disconnects between where the experts and clinicians live and where the students are who need the services. And so teletherapy has really emerged in a big way across all of these different fields as a way to get patients, to get students access to therapists. I think another thing that not everyone realizes about teletherapy is that it's more than just it's more than just FaceTime or Zoom or Skype or whatever method you might think of. It's more than just looking at someone on a screen and talking to them and interacting that way. There are often other tools on a platform, games, activities, assessments. You can show videos. It's very interactive experience.
Right. And I imagine there's been an evolution there. Like we've seen, personally, I've seen it over the last 10 years, focusing mainly on Kaplan's live online programs. Early on, it was kind of new, different, exciting, and, it appealed probably most to the more adventurous early adopter, tech-savvy audience, tech-savvy segment. I imagine there may have been historically a little bit of that trend within schools. I'd love to hear your perspective, but at least what I've seen over the last 4 or 5 years at least, is that it's becoming more just an expectation and something that a broader market, also the emerging generation, Gen Z, is more comfortable with screens, and I think their parents are frequently more comfortable choosing an online option like that. Have you seen similar trends around, how schools are ready for teletherapy as opposed to, having a more traditional model?
There's definitely been an evolution, and it's really similar to what we saw in broader online
Hmm.
learning over the past decade plus. I mean, I think of in general online learning, there was this evolution not only in cultural comfort levels
Hmm.
with interacting through technology, but with what the modality was doing.
Hmm.
And it's like you said, in the early days of live online, you were essentially filming someone standing in the front of a classroom, and
Right.
there wasn't as much personalization, there wasn't as much interactivity.
Yep.
It was really, I think, viewed as an acceptable substitute for in-person learning if you had no other option.
Yes.
And it grew over time and evolved, and people could really see the ways in which online learning could be certainly equal and often better,
Hmm.
because you could personalize it more, and you
Yeah.
could add more features to what you were doing in an online setting.
Right.
So teletherapy has had a similar evolution. I think it started later. It's been around for a long time.
Hmm.
There was a Mayo Clinic equivalency study in 1997 that first validated that teletherapy was a valid and effective method for serving students and patients generally.
Yep.
But I would say it wasn't until 2009 approximately, which is when Presence Learning was first founded, that it started to be used in a school setting
Yep.
at all. And at the beginning, it was definitely viewed as, I need to serve students. If I don't have any in-person options, I'll give this a try.
Right.
It's grown over time to be something that educators really believe in and use as a tool to
Hmm.
do more than just substitute for the offline experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Fully understand what you're talking about, and I also think the related point is that through live online, through telehealth, teletherapy, you open up access to expertise that you could never really solve on a local in-person level. So in addition to the experience becoming better and more differentiated, maybe even exceeding what a face-to-face could do in some ways, there's the demand side of the equation where, like, when you don't have access to speech pathologists or speech therapists or school psychologists in underserved districts, telehealth is solving that problem. Presence learning is solving that problem in a very genuine way, the access problem.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a significant mismatch in the supply and demand
Hmm.
in this area in particular. So you have 7 million students across the country who have been diagnosed with a special education need. A lot of that relates to speech therapy or language therapy needs.
Hmm.
You only have about 60,000 certified school-based speech therapists nationwide. So
Hmm.
you think about just the sheer numbers of it, you're already at a capacity challenge. And then when you layer onto that the geography of it and trying to get people physically to a room and making that work, I mean, it's really a challenge for
Hmm.
schools, particularly in rural districts, to be able to find the professionals locally.
Yeah.
And a lot of the needs are in those more remote rural districts.
Yep.
We have district partners that we work with in rural areas that might have 20% plus of their population has special needs,
Yep.
where the nationwide average is 13%. So
Right.
there's really a need to get the expert services to these places where you just can't, from a practical perspective, have to drive.
Right. 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 And then the other aspect of that is on the side of the professional. Like, this opens up new work-life balance opportunities where, rather than being on the road visiting schools or only having access to work in my local district, what I believe, I'd love to hear you talk more about this, but like this will open up opportunities for speech therapists and school psychologists and folks with training in behavioral education, um, to find new ways in which they can really deliver their own services.
Yeah, for the majority of the clinicians that are coming to work with us at Presence Learning, they part of why they choose teletherapy is exactly for the work-life balance.
Mm-hmm.
So 97% of our therapists are women, and 3/4 of them are working moms.
Mm-hmm.
And so from their perspective, they love the work that they do. They love working in schools, but it often gets to a point where going on site and working full time and not having any flexibility becomes too difficult for them to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
So, we hear over and over again in the stories from our therapists that teletherapy offered them a way to continue doing that work,
Mm-hmm.
the work that they love most, which is the direct interactions with students, but in a way that they could actually fit. And, when they go out and they talk about that and, look to recruit and expand the next generation of therapists,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really appealing. I mean, it's offering people a view to a path that they can see themselves, staying on throughout a career. So
Yeah.
I think it's really significant for the profession.
Yeah, exactly. And you save on like all that inefficiency around travel too, so like when you're either providing the direct value from your home,
Mm-hmm.
or you're doing something else. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and it reminds me a lot of the dynamics in online tutoring
Mm-hmm.
from both the company's perspective and the tutor's perspective. You don't want them to be driving. You don't want to be paying them for
Right.
driving time. You want to be
Right.
paying them for connecting with students,
Yeah.
and that's how they want to spend their time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it really is so much more efficient if they can spend the majority of their working time connecting directly with students instead of doing all the other logistics
Sure.
that are involved in going on site.
Yeah, exactly. And you talked a little bit about this when we were getting started, just preparing for the conversation, but there's some benefits and drawbacks of teletherapy versus in person. Some of the drawbacks I think are probably obvious, where like you're not physically in the same space. Some of the advantages may be less obvious. So one of the things you were discussing was just this notion, if let's say I have a behavioral problem, I'm on an IEP, and there's some stigma associated with that. And rather than having that understood as like a face-to-face solution, the idea that it's a little bit anonymized by working through teletherapy is appealing in some cases. And I'd also love to understand a little more the dynamics around speech therapy versus mental health therapy.
Yeah.
But any thoughts on just the notion of some of the surprising, non-obvious benefits of teletherapy?
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting dynamics. One is for some students who have a behavioral challenge or condition that might lead to them being uncomfortable in a room with a new adult who they
Mm-hmm.
haven't interacted with. What we hear from our therapists is that the process of warming up and getting comfortable flows a lot more easily and goes a lot more quickly
Mm-hmm.
when the student's connecting through a screen. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something that we see across speech, across the school psychology and OT pieces. Is
Mm-hmm.
just there for some children, there's just a more comfortable connection
Mm-hmm.
when you're doing it through a screen
Yeah.
instead of with this new person and this new dynamic in the room. So
Right.
that's
Right.
really interesting.
Sure.
The other area you touched on the idea of the stigma behind some of the services, or maybe just again the comfort level with talking about what you're going through, particularly on the mental health side, the school psychology side. We hear consistently from our schools that it's appealing to them to have a therapist working with their students who's not part of the local community, isn't walking the halls, doesn't know the parents,
Hmm.
that all of that added anonymity really frees up the student to speak comfortably
Hmm.
about what they're going through and to speak more openly. So that's a real advantage.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into a little more of the mental health aspect in particular, because I think one thing I try to say on the show as often as possible is it's very zeitgeisty. So it is something that is bubbling up to national news from time to time. Like, how do we think about the growing mental health crisis that's emerging, particularly in children and adolescents? So I'd love to get into that a little bit, but before digging in there, any thoughts or any context for folks just understanding the speech and occupational therapy, because it sounds like all three components are pretty central to what presence learning is doing. So I'd love to get into the mental health stuff, but before we exit speech and occupational therapy, anything you think is worthy a note before moving more into the mental health side?
So on the speech and occupational therapy side, which is, as you say, the origins of presence learning and the initial problem we were looking to help schools solve,
Hmm.
is those services are typically tied to the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act and to IEPs, and so you have students, again, 7 million of them across the country, who have an IEP and have a need for support services. Schools do struggle to get the therapists in person on staff at the schools. And so that's where presence learning initially came in, with the solution of teletherapy to help schools serve the students. I mean, you see some really tough numbers of the number of these IEPs that go unserved or underserved. New York City Public Schools, for example, publishes their numbers every year. Last year, 22% of students with IEPs went underserved or
Hmm.
unserved.
Hmm.
So, there's this very acute need that schools have to provide those services. There's an added pressure that, a parent does have the option of suing the school through a due process
Hmm.
claim if they feel that the services are not being delivered
Right.
to the recommended amount. So this is a very fraught area for schools,
Yep.
and so where presence learning comes in is to help schools solve that and to get the students the therapy services that they need, which is of course what everybody wants, what
Sure.
everybody's trying to do. It's
Yeah.
just not always as easy as it can be.
Right.
Where we focus a lot of our efforts these days is in trying to make it easier for schools to use teletherapy. We talked about the sort of evolution and the acceptance of it and the desire to use it.
Yep.
There are a lot of other regulatory challenges. A lot of this is state by state.
Yep.
All of these forms of clinical licenses are state by state. So,
Yep.
if I live in New York, but I want to serve a student in Oregon, I need to go get cross licensed there and
Yeah.
maintain that license and pay for that license. So,
Hmm.
there's a lot of friction in that area. There's different regulations by state and what's
Hmm.
allowed and what's reimbursable for teletherapy. So I think there's a lot more that we could do that would just be really good for
Yeah.
schools and for students with special needs
Hmm.
to facilitate teletherapy. So
Yeah.
that's really the origin of where presence learning was, created, and,
Hmm.
what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
What we've seen is that, as we expanded and started adding on mental health services and school psychology services, we're really doing that in response to what we were hearing from our school partners they also needed help with, and I think increasingly need help with. I mean, as
Yeah.
you say, this is the big topic. I mean, everyone is talking about crisis prevention and
Hmm.
intervention.
Yep.
Everyone's talking about teen suicide
Yep.
rates,
Yep.
which are, 17%, I think I just read, of,
Yep.
of high school students have considered taking their own lives.
Yeah.
I mean, that's shocking. And I think everyone in a community, schools as well as parents, feel like they want to, take responsibility for identifying the risk factors, intervening early, getting students the support that they need.
Yeah.
And, again, this is an area where teletherapy can really help do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And you were saying this is probably the fastest growing part of
It
your,
is.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's the fastest growing and it's the most talked about. I mean, I would say when I'm speaking to school administrators, some of the most common requests I get are, can you help us do a training around identifying, bullying evidence
sure,
or suicide risk
sure,
factors. These are the topics that are really on the minds of school administrators
mm-hmm,
where they're seeing the connections between those issues and those risk areas and the overall health of the students and the academic success of the students.
yeah,
Another thing I read recently was 160,000 students every day skip school because they're worried about a bullying situation.
wow,
So you think of that, you play that through, and the
yeah,
impact that's going to have on the students' academic success and achievement is a real issue
yeah,
that
yeah.
schools want to figure out how to help with.
Yeah, well, and it's also great that you already have inroads to solve some of these problems around, the traditional special education track, or maybe like the speech one in
Mm-hmm.
particular, because I think that's really how presence learning sort of established this connectivity into K-12
Yeah,
schools. And
yeah,
now you can be responsive to emerging needs like these emerging mental health
yeah,
challenges.
yeah. And for even on the school psychology side and on the social work side, I think that the most established process within schools tends to be for the students with a specific diagnosis or condition or
Yep.
special education needs. So, because the IDEA regulations are so strong and so clear in advocating for the right to support services for students with special needs, that has been, I think, the most well-funded area and,
Yep.
and the clearest area in terms of process. So, within our mental health services, we see, sort of the most certainty and clarity from schools in what they want to do and what they want to accomplish with those special needs students. But, in general, for the school approach to mental health these days is typically taking a multi-tiered systems of support approach. And people think about 3 tiers. The tier 3, the top tier, is those diagnosed students with special needs and specific therapy requirements.
Mm-hmm.
It's the tier 1, the looking at your general population, monitoring mental health, educating on mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and educating your administrators and teachers on identification of risk factors,
Yeah.
and then moving into tier 2 of when you identify risk factors, what are you going to do? How can you intervene? What are some programs that you can run, often at the group level,
Yep.
to try to address environmental factors or behavioral factors and get those students back on the right track?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the areas that everyone's talking about, everyone's thinking about. There are a lot of conversations at the state level about requirements and programming and funding, but there's a lot to come and a lot more needed. So those are the really interesting conversations
Yeah.
that schools are having now, is what can they do, what should they do, how can they interact with parents,
Right.
and how can we help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was interesting when we were prepping. You were talking about, I guess, in that tier 2 range, pre-diagnosis. A good one nice aspect of Live Online as an intervention is that students who might feel more singled out and isolated as a problem child will be connected to a broader set through technology like Live Online, so that they could see, I'm actually not alone. There's other kids out there like me. Because in addition to the cyberbullying component of our mental health challenges that we're facing, there's also a real loneliness problem,
Yeah.
and a sense of social isolation, social fragmentation that's sort of coinciding with the use of social media, the use of screens, gaming crisis, all those types of things. But I thought it was very interesting when you were talking about how, in many ways, schools aspire to be preventative rather than just respond to the kids with the diagnosis. And I thought it was really interesting what you were describing. I'd love to hear your thoughts a little more on this around uh, the one level below a diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
and how Live Online as an intervention can be really effective there.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about that tier two, it's not even really pre-diagnosis, because in most of these cases, it's not about diagnosing a disability or a condition.
Hmm.
When that happens, that's going to be up in that tier three, and it's often the best solution is going to be one-to-one therapy.
Yep.
You're looking at different factors in the tier one, tier two, where it's environmental, it's situational.
Hmm.
There are things that you can do, and skills and strategies that
Hmm.
you can teach to students to help them work through those issues and get back to stronger mental health,
Hmm.
and then of course ultimately back to academic success. And in doing that, what a lot of experts find is that you can do it through small group
Hmm.
instruction
Hmm.
rather than through one-on-one. And in fact, small group instruction, and like you say, seeing that there are others like you going through the same things and being able to talk that through is often a big help to students who are in that tier two.
Hmm.
And where teletherapy is really great is because you can run a therapy group across multiple locations,
Right.
you can connect students who are more alike in what they're going through, and also students who aren't sitting next to each other in homeroom.
Right.
So again, getting away from that stigma, encouraging more openness. It's a lot easier to talk about your problems when you're in high school, when you're not talking about them in front of somebody who you're going to then see in gym class or whatever it is,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Yeah. It all seems to tie back to that access problem where, like, frequently these children in distress are don't have access to like trained adults who they can trust, who will give them the specific services that they need.
mhm.
Where do you see this heading in the next next 5-10 years? Like, do you, because it does feel like with the advent of online education where it is, and this emerging um, you know, mental health crisis that
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people are calling it a crisis, and I actually think it is. Where do you see it heading? Like, I mean, it sounds like presence learning could play a meaningful role in wherever it is heading. But as an expert, like, where do you think the world of special education, online special education, and online special education in response to some of these emerging mental health challenges that we're facing? Any thoughts on where it might go?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be lot more a lot more activity that we'll see from schools, and a lot more funding for professional development, education across all teachers, administrators, the people on the front lines at schools. They are looking for help in identifying risk factors. And I think there's an increasing call culturally for our educators to take some accountability for watching and looking and spotting those risk factors, right? Like
Yep.
that's the first step
Hmm.
to crisis prevention.
Right.
And I think that we're going to see more funding come from states to facilitate that kind of programming,
Yep.
and more of a standard expectation around schools and school administrators having that ability across their staff
Hmm.
to identify the risk factors. So I
Yep.
think that's a big thing we're going to see. Then moving from there, where I think in particular teletherapy really comes in, is in what to do next when you have identified those risk factors. And that's where I think, again, with the support of more funding
Hmm.
from states in particular, we'll be able to see schools unlock more budget to actually run programming or place students in programming to address some of these issues that
Hmm.
they're spotting. I think, the right now where we're at, I feel like everybody does identify it as a crisis and something we need to address, but there is a lack of funding.
Yep.
And that is, I mean, the realities of being an administrator in a K-12 district today is that
Sure.
you're spending so much time and effort figuring out how to make use of the budget you have, how to tap into funding that you don't have but you really want to
Hmm.
to deliver all of these services. And
Right.
I think there's so much conversation going on right now about how to designate more funding for areas of mental health. And I think, every time that we have a crisis at a school, I think of, looking at where Florida is getting to
Mm-hmm.
with funding for crisis prevention
Mm-hmm.
coming out of Parkland. I mean, it's sad that it gets to these moments
Yeah.
to drive behavior, but I think that's what's happening. And every time something like that happens, it's really providing another push.
Makes sense. Yeah. And then we're getting close to time, and I definitely want to get any parting thoughts from you. But before the parting thoughts, what about the role or like providing similar services for, you touched on it a little bit, for educators and for families and parents? It does, we talked briefly about Talkspace as sort of the adult version of on like teletherapy, um, outside of what's delivered through schools, or even what could be delivered through schools, beyond, connecting somebody like a licensed practitioner to kids who need those services. How are you thinking, or how would you expect things to evolve around providing parents better education, better tools to use in their home to identify similar risk factors? And then also, it sounds like Presence Learning is exploring providing more of these types of services to just the general population of educators. Any thoughts on those areas?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, we so often get requests from schools, and we do already on an ad hoc basis programming around professional development for spotting risk factors and addressing them from there. So I think that's that's an area that I think we need a lot more of,
Mm-hmm.
that schools really want. From a parent perspective, there, I would love to find a way to help parents. I'm thinking a lot about, how can we get more information and make it accessible for parents to
Mm-hmm.
really not only understand the risk factors, but, when they have a student who they're seeing, a child who they're seeing have challenges, what could they do about it? What should they be asking schools to do about it? How can they advocate
Yeah.
for their child? These are areas where parents really struggle to find information, and they're definitely hungry for more information.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that I hear, that I get asked for a lot within Presence Learning, is from our own network of therapists. So we work with about 1,000 therapists across the country, and they often ask if we could find a way to open up our teletherapy platform for them to use directly with
Mm-hmm.
parents
Mm-hmm.
and with students. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another area where there's a lot more that I think parents would like to have happening, and are willing to support
Mm-hmm.
outside of the school and outside of the classroom, are incremental to the services
Yeah.
that students are receiving there. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think all of that flows together.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot more to do, in particular for parents, to make sure that they have access to everything that they need or want
Yeah.
to be addressing some of these factors at home.
Yeah, even like the support group aspect that you were kind of talking about around the small groups of kids, their parents frequently are,
Yeah, yeah,
struggling with this stuff, and then also struggling with the stigma too,
yeah,
so just providing more support to parents will be an interesting aspect of this.
yeah, and more connections to
Yeah,
other parents who are
yeah.
going through it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a wonderful conversation. Thanks very much for joining us, Kate. Just as we're getting closer to concluding here, are there any other trends, maybe outside of your field, or any parting thoughts to impart on all of us on your way on in your life?
Sure. I mean, I think that, we talked a lot about the sort of evolution of online learning and what that's looking like in terms of the evolution for not only teletherapy but telehealth. And I think that there's really interesting things already happening, and a lot more to come,
Mm-hmm.
beyond telehealth where it's at today, to really looking at driving mental health, well-being,
Mm-hmm.
healthy balance, mindfulness. I mean, I think that
Yes.
there's so much more to do. And I've always believed across the work I've done that all of that kind of work is better done when you give people access to experts
Hmm.
and, let them tap into that expertise as they're figuring out their own path to whether it be to education or to health.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's so much we can do in an online environment with online tools to get people a sort of expert directed path
Hmm.
to mental health generally.
Yeah, yeah, we should be removing the access problem from
Yeah.
the equation, and
Mm-hmm.
technology is allowing us to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's great that there are organizations like Presence Learning that are really out there in the field solving this real problem. Hopefully, the 22% of folks who needed access and weren't getting it, as one example, like
Mm-hmm.
that's a big part of the population who can get genuine help just by opening up access
Right.
through digital solutions. So thanks again for joining us,
Thank
Kate.
you.
Yeah, it was wonderful having you on the show. Kate Eberle-Walker, CEO of Presence Learning. If you look up Presence Learning, you'll find Kate and Presence Learning there, and you can learn more, whether you're a parent, an educator, or just interested in what's emerging around telehealth and teletherapy and all the themes we talked about today. Wonderful show. Thanks again, Kate. And thanks to our listeners for listening. This is Trending in Education. We'll be back again soon.